Hello everyone, my name is Kat Sivertsen. I'm an artist living and working in the unceded traditional territory of the Lheidli First Nation, in a place that we now call Prince George in north central British Columbia. I'm going to talk to you today about two series of exhibitions or installations that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with Two Rivers Gallery and with Two Rivers Gallery, their regional outreach exhibition program this summer. Before I get started on the artwork, I'd like to acknowledge the huge team that keeps the gallery together. The envy of many other towns or cities our size, this team is doing incredible work at a very challenging time. From George Harris, the curator, down to the frontline staff of Chris, Olivia, and Chaos. We're really fortunate to have such an engaged group of people bringing the arts to our community. Here I am, feeling pretty good about the installation at the gallery, and without which support from Regional District of Fraser Fort George, the regional outreach program wouldn't have happened. The regional work has been on tour all summer, and right now, today, September 24th, is the last day for the exhibition to be seen at the Valemount Area Museum. Anastasia has been working with the public, engaging with the public on the installation or the exhibition, and has been really supportive of the work. If you don't get a chance to go down there today, you could drive out west for an hour and go to see the same artwork in a different location in McBride, October 1st to 31st. I'll be there myself on October 2nd, giving a workshop, an artist book making workshop. And if you're interested in that, you just contact Bridget at the museum, and she give you all the information that you require. The work was also exhibited in the Mackenzie Community Arts Center for the month of August, and I was fortunate to be able to travel to Mackenzie and give a short talk, and then also run a very engaging, sort of intimate workshop on artist bookmaking. It was really enjoyable. I was really fortunate to be able to do that. And a shout out to Deb Law, who's looking after that wonderful center for the community of Mackenzie. As I mentioned, I'm going to unpack the relationship between the artworks, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I am the eldest daughter of 4 from first-generation Canadian father with Northern Irish ancestry, and my mother, who is the youngest daughter of prairie settlers with a layered ancestry. That family crossed over the U.S. border early in the 20th century. I have 1 son and 2 grandchildren. I grew up on the coast and lived 20 years in England. I moved back to BC, specifically to Prince George, to be near family and to regroup. That was only supposed to be for a minute, and that was 15 years ago. And those of you who are listening, who do live in this area, you know what I'm talking about. I've been a practicing artist for 3 decades with formal training to the master's level as well as informal training, both valuable. And like many artists, I have a day job to ensure that I can pay the rent. My arts practice is autobiographic in source and primarily sculptural in form or outcome. I've installed work in a variety of places, inside galleries, schools, hospitals, outside on beaches, farms, and even in a vicarage. In England and in Australia, as well as here at home. My studio practice is based in drawing and writing. I'm an advocate for arts as wellness, which is woven into my work, my teaching, and over the last few years, my collaborations. Which brings me to the current body of work in the touring exhibition and how it relates to the installation at Two Rivers Gallery. And before that, what the relationships I have with the objects that are involved in both exhibitions. In the original exhibition, there are 3 images of laundry, documentary images, photographed by Birgit Alligar in a project that she was working on around photographing hands, the hands of creativity. The 3 images relate to the simple act of hanging laundry, an old, or some might say an ancient practice that was once lost due to the advent of the dryer, but I feel it's on a revival, almost like an act of defiance. Or not defiance, it's one of those simple acts of that can shift an idea of thinking if we're considering or awake to the concept of climate change. Hanging laundry is a repetitive act, one of renewal, cleansing, it's a refresh, and ultimately it's an engagement in being involved in the process. The objects themselves are beautiful. There is a texture to them. When they're wet and when they're dry, there's another texture. There's nothing like laundry that's been hung on the line. And come on, you can't deny getting into fresh pajamas, into that beautifully crisp, laundered, fresh bed. Ultimately, hanging laundry is a meditation for me. It's like the practice of Zen. It's the process of being in the moment and honoring that particular moment at that time. This project started as a Millennium project called Airing It. 200 white Irish linen tea towels installed in a variety of locations throughout the southwest of England and later in Australia. The number 200 is related to the millennium year, and the white Irish linen is an homage to my Northern Irish grandmother, Mary. Mary was also known as Molly and grew up in Belfast during the early days of the Troubles between Northern Ireland and England. As a young girl, her father was mysteriously killed, and at that time there were no social services to support the young widow, Mrs. McNeil, and her 3 daughters. So Mary and her 2 sisters were sent to an orphanage until they were old enough, probably 12 years old, maybe even younger, to go work in the linen factories, which wasn't unheard of at that time. When Mary came of age, the family emigrated to Canada, where Mary took on the name of Molly after she married her longtime Protestant sweetheart, John, who was also known as Jack. They raised 6 children in Vancouver, where Jack and Molly, hard-working people, worked in service of others their entire lives. The project was installed in a variety of configurations, and like regular laundry, it was put up at the beginning of the day and taken in at the evening. Here I am working with youth at a place called the Study Gallery in Poole in Dorset, hanging up laundry and having a social engagement with them about that Zen practice and about being really mindful about what they're doing. Of course, it looks like they're actually acting out a superhero fantasies with the laundry. It's quite funny. The project itself has been really well received. This group of college students wanted to install the laundry in their cafeteria as in an acknowledgement of the dinner ladies who they felt were being mistreated. And then, of course, there are those moments of silence where there are no words to describe your experience of standing in the middle of a laundry line or circle, like this woman standing on Fremantle Beach in Western Australia, as the memory takes her back to another time and another place. At Two Rivers Gallery, there are 21 tea tails suspended on 3 separate lines. 3 times 21 equals 63, which is my current number of years. 21 also relates to a sort of coming of age, and in conversation with the curator, George Harris, he writes, "The coming of age differs according to cultural traditions, but for Sivertsen that age is 21. In this work, she uses the notion of coming of age conceptually, alluding to phases in both her own personal development as well as to her family history, of which I've just told you the story about Mary or Molly. At this time, I'd like to draw your attention to the drawings that surround the installation of the laundry. These are called fire escapes, and the drawings were made after visiting fire sites on the Blackwater, Norman Lake, and Sutherland Forest Service roads. I'm going to just play a quick video. It's sort of a walk-by video. And of course, the note here is I'm grateful to be able to have been able to access those traditional lands of the Lheidli Sycos, and Nadli-Wuten First Nations. The idea of the drawings were initially to be done en plein air outside, but logistically that just wasn't possible. So I went out with my collaborator, Anne-Rose Georgeson, and I took a series of photographs of chosen spots, and each 3 panels of 10 by 30 inches represents one of those images of that place. George Harris wrote about the fire escapes in this way. Situating herself at the edge of each site, Sivertsen follows the regular intervals of the tree line, marking her substrate in rhythm with the landscape. She breathes in her scorched surrounds, placing each mark, documenting the landscape with reverence. The repetitive act of inscribing its dark vertical lines mimic that of a stylus on an electrocardiogram machine, monitoring the body's electrical impulses as a measure of the heart's activity. As a portrait emerges, so too does a document of self. Not unlike an electrocardiogram, each mark an assertion of life, as surely as it is an inscription of death. Three sites, 2 fires. The Little Bobtail Lake Fire and of 2016, and 2018, the Shovel Lake Fire. In the regional exhibitions, you'll find 3 drawings, the beginning of 3 drawings of that series of work. And there's 63 installed at the gallery. And these were done early on. These were from a visit in 2016 to the Little Bobtail Lake Fire via the Norman Lake Service Road. And I'd just like to describe some of the process of doing that. So in 2016, I basically accosted Anne-Rose Georgeson and in the hallway at the College of New Caledonia, where she teaches in the Fine Arts program, and said, I've heard that you and I should be doing some work together because we have a similar aesthetic. And she said, I've heard that too. She said, do you want to go on a drive out to a forest fire site? Sure. So in 2016, Anne-Rose drove me to the Little Bobtail Lake Fire via the Norman Lake Forest Service Road. And this was my first experience of walking on a land that had was on the road to recovery from a wildfire the previous fire season. It was a very bizarre experience. Walking on the land was like walking on a burnt sponge. To witness the trees left standing because the fire moves through so quickly, it blistered and scarred the trees, but didn't quite devour them. These trees are left standing like sentinels to welcome and hold space for the next generation of growth. And this next generation of growth is represented by the gold leaf. In 2000, after that visit, Anne Rose and I, literally, we didn't talk, we didn't draw or anything on site, but we took a lot of photographs and we started sharing envelopes of that evidence of that visit individually and responding to the marks by creating our own. I don't know if you can see this, but there are 3 separate pieces of paper that are going through and a sort of layered conversation about that particular place and that particular experience. This work was exhibited in the group show Voice. In 2019, this continuing work was exhibited in an exhibition curated by Megan Hunter-Gauthier called Record Revise, and it was about the notion of books in terms of artists' books, which is quite significant in the development of my most recent work. In 2019, later on in that year, I was invited to be the artist in residence for Two Rivers Gallery's Kids Art Days. 2 days of art-based activities, and because in the last few years, not the last couple, they've been counting people, and they have between 8,000 and 10,000 people engaging in arts-based activities. So what we did, I was still sort of working on the notion of fire and called this installation Playing with Fire. I cut out tree shapes and engaged with the public using what I call fire sticks and natural wildfire charcoal to make marks and to make the surface of a wildfire tree stand. So the engagement was about making marks, about having a conversation about wildfire, and if you've lived near wildfire, which these ones are an hour or 2 away from our fair city, there is a level of anxiety that develops. So with the public, we created a wildfire stand without actually drawing any trees. Invisible paradox. This is one of a couple of studies that I've done based on invisible paradox, which is an installation I did in 2003. This is part of the touring exhibition. It's quite a large shadow box, and it's got a deconstructed crystal necklace inside of it. Initially, the project Invisible Paradox was trying to get my head around, what beauty means and what the notion of beauty means. And so, as you can see, the beautiful Audrey Hepburn from Breakfast at Tiffany's is still looking in the Tiffany window and all those glittery, shiny objects. She's bedazzled herself and looking rather glamorous. And then, of course, there's also from that time frame the wonderful Elizabeth Taylor. And think about sort of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s when all of these sort of movie magazines started coming out, all these fashion magazines. So people like my mother, and primarily my mother-in-law, would be greatly influenced on what that notion of beauty was. My mother-in-law, as I mentioned, was never caught without any lipstick on or some sort of costume jewelry. Because when she wore that, she felt like she was being seen and that she was considered beautiful. 2003, Invisible Paradox, the Study Gallery in Poole. 3-story glass cube building with crystal beads suspended from floor to ceiling. And the story, that the basis of this installation goes something like this. I was out for lunch with a friend in a pub. I went up to the barman to order some coffee. He looked straight through me, like I wasn't even there. I had to speak to be seen. And when I returned to the table, I expressed my confusion, dismay, and annoyance. My friend replied, "Oh, darling, don't you know that when one reaches a certain age, one becomes invisible?" So this project became more about capturing a moment in time, freezing it, or remaining in situ for that moment, the moment you're in, that moment of beauty, along with that notion of what does beauty. All of these glass beads came from junk shops, from places like Value Village, not in antique shops. They still at that time had no value. That notion of beauty had been tossed away. I was thinking about the aging process for women and the concept of fecundity or fertility, and asking the question, is beauty only perceived when you produce eggs, whether in a gallery or in a barn? So here we are in the middle. Well, we're supposed to be near the end, but I believe we're still in the middle of a pandemic. In May 2020, I received a telephone call from George Harris, and myself and a few other artists were given a question or a commission around the question, what does an artist consider during a pandemic? So my first thought, like even before he finished the sentence, was, well, it's really apparent to me that this is beyond me. It's beyond an individual's response. And it's more at that time, which was becoming very apparent when people are performing on their balconies in Italy and in Germany, that this is beyond one person, but it is a collective of all people. And so what I did was I decided to organize a party. Just because I was told I couldn't see anyone, that's all I really wanted to do, is I wanted to reach out and I wanted to connect with people. So I did. I invited 30 odd people, creative people that I know, to a garden party. The invitations went out, which meant, now I'm really committed. And so I had to begin or get started on preparing for the party. I planted a garden, literally and figuratively. While I was sort of musing over this whole idea over the telephone with one of my colleagues, I told them that I was doing this, and their first response was, planting a garden is like planting hope, which at that time was the perfect antidote to being forced into isolation during a pandemic. The following 3 images are a sample of that party prep. So what I was doing is I sent each of the artists a piece of paper, a Canson piece of paper like this one, 10 by 14 inches with a fold already in the middle, and asked them to respond to that question. So I needed something to hold the party together, to host the party. So what better thing to do is to create a series of drawings to go in between each of the artist's replies. These are Narcissus, Lily Stamen, Stargazer Lily Stamen. So drawings of those beautiful, wobbly, alive stamen in the center of a stargazer lily. and drawn with that wonderful gold dust mixed with water that Lily Staven gifts us with. A delightful little um, mouse nest, and the mouse nest is tiny, fits in the palm of your hand. I found it on the middle of like on the edge of a road near a forest. And so I decided that this too belonged in my garden. I prepared 25 images like these and then waited for the guests to arrive. Each of the guests arrived to the party in the order that their responses came back from in the post, in the mail. 24 of the 30 RSVP'd positively, and these 24 people I had built relationships with over probably 21 years, going along with the concept of the coming of age. And they're all located in England, Scotland, Germany, France, Singapore, and of course in Canada. I made a conscious note not to invite anyone from Prince George, any creatives that I am lucky enough to know here, because I figured that they were having a similar experience to mine. So I just want to call your attention to the beautiful table that Two Rivers Gallery commissioned Robert Dyson to create. It's almost like an altar piece holding the party, like holding the guests, like in a circle of love. Yeah, a circle of love. And the beads, you can see them suspended in the center, is holding space. It's honoring the space. It's asking us to stop for a minute and to recognize yourself and where you're at. So along with the question about what does an artist do during a pandemic, I sent the brief, which was please reply about where you're at, but also putting into some context about where I was at and what I was thinking. So I'm just going to read you a transcription of the text. As you can see, there's text written in between each of the images. Welcome to the Covidian Garden Party. Please help yourself to a drink, but first take a seat and allow me to tell you a story. In November 2012, I had a Whipple procedure to curtail pancreatic cancer. During my recovery, rather under the influence, I had a vision, and it went something like this. I was in a hot air balloon, you know, the old-fashioned kind, with a squeaky wicker basket and a giant white balloon. The ride was beautiful, slow, and deliberate. It was breathtaking. I was floating over familiar landscapes. We landed with a gentle bump in the middle of a garden. It was an overgrown English garden with a burbling fountain for centerpiece, situated near a well-loved potting shed, supported by a once grand queue-like greenhouse. It was bursting with runaway plants that were escaping through cracks, gaps, and gullies in search of fresh air. The garden was in its glory and at its best. Her flowers, fruit trees, and veg intermingled with wild things, crossing over loose borders of unattended grass. It was all held together by a crumbling stone wall, preoccupied with a life of its own. There were a lot of people there. I knew them all, and they me. It was a party, with all my people, just as I remembered each and every one, all looking wonderful in their creative best. Everyone was dressed in white. So was I. I wandered through the garden, arriving at an old table draped in white linen, displaying an array of antique glassware, delicate to the touch and my eye. I was greeted by the curator's wife with, "Hello, darling. Would you like a glass of sherry?" She handed me the fine glass. I smiled. She smiled. I moved on. So beautiful, so lovely, even luxurious. Such are the layers of delight. I mused my surround. In looking about, everyone was enjoying themselves so, talking, laughing, remembering, and knowing. All smiling, waving kisses to me as I did them. The director of the gallery was standing next to me. We hugged. I whispered to her, "Carolyn, it's time for me to go." She looked at me with a tender smile and said, "Oh, Kat, you can't leave yet. There's too much work to do." Susan Barton Tate, Gunhild Lorenzen, Alicia Proudfoot, Barbara Schultz, Kim Stewart, Graham Snow, Susan Jessup, Fran Quinlan, Lucy Strachan, Georgie Hawkes, Johannes von Stum, David Atkinson, Tracy Stewart, David Atkins, Sandy Kirkby, Andy Kirkby, Diana Thornycroft, Jason Curley, Laura Walcott, Johnny Hawkes, Kathy Charles Wareid, Anne Rose Georgeson, Sarah Grace Dye, and Barbara Jane Cowie, all guests of honor at the Covidian Garden Party. There's a version of the Covidian Garden Party at each of the exhibition sites. However, it's a long video and it does take a bit of time to listen to it. So if you're able, I'd love it if you give it some time. It's a really beautiful object and sort of like a bedtime story during a pandemic. So, along with all the excitement of the summer outreach program for kindergarten to grade 7 students, the regional outreach program exhibition, the installation of Two Rivers Gallery, there's also a catalog that's been created. It's just been finished and printed and will be available next week in McBride, and of course later on in Prince George. I'd like to finish off with sending a note to George Harris. This one's for you. It has been a real pleasure getting to know you as a curator. You are a great listener and a wonderful collaborator. It has been such an honor for my work to be acknowledged by you as a curator, but almost more importantly, as a writer. You have a gift with words. Thank you, George. With that in mind, I'd like to close with these final remarks written by George in the catalog. And while it is difficult to imagine finding solace and comfort amidst a forest of burned trees, Sivertsen does. In a different form of coming of age, Sivertsen finds peace with her mortality. Facing a surgery with an uncertain outcome altered her view of life and instilled an appreciation for every moment and stage of being. As one phase of life concludes, another begins. The burned remains of an old forest form the cradle for a new one, and here she feels a pregnant silence. Here, the beat of one's own heart is especially poignant, and each mark evidence of a life continued as much as it is a record of place. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience. I encourage you to look at the work and to ask any questions, any comments that you have in the timeline of this posting. And again, thank you for your attention.